Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be looking at the tiebreaker section of the 2018 World Chess Championships between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana. If you have not been following along, the championship was meant for 12 games. They did play those 12 games, but they were all draws, so we do not have a champion after the normal classical rounds, which brings us to the tiebreaker. They had yesterday off to prepare because they were going to come back and they were going to play today until there was a champion. That's exactly what they did. If you're not familiar with how the tiebreaker is set up, they first start out with rapid chess. You get 25 minutes on your clock after every move. You do get 10 seconds added. They play up to 4 games and see who has the most points. If there's not a winner after that, they go to blitz. And blitz is 5 minutes on the clock and then 3 seconds added on after that. We're going to be looking at a game from the rapid portion, and we're in specifically game number 3. Magnus Carlsen playing the white pieces. He also played in game number 1. So we get into it. Magnus Carlsen starts with pawn to e4. And then pawn c5, the Sicilian defense. Very interesting from Fabiano. He's so used to playing pawn e5, knight f3, knight f6, getting into the Petrov defense. He has all this memorized, especially for fast chess. Would expect him to play something more like this, just because he doesn't have to spend any time thinking about the moves. It's all memorized to him. It's his favorite defense. But he decides to play something different and goes with pawn to c5, the Sicilian defense. Magnus now brings the knight to f3, pawn e6, so not your common Sicilian defense, what we've seen in the past. Pawn to c4, so very different from Magnus Carlsen as well. Knight to c6, pawn up here to d4. So Magnus looking to push his advantage in the center of the board. Pawn takes here, knight recaptures, and then the bishop comes down here to c5. And it's always good to think about what happens if you take here. You don't want to be taking with your knight here on d4. White's just going to have all the advantage in the center of the board. Queen takes on d4. And then how does black continue here? Knight to f6 is pretty bad because there's a pawn up here to e5. There's no good squares for the knight to come to. Even knight to h5 is met by pawn g4. This is all going to be bad. But if you don't come here, where else are you going to go? Pawn to b6, starting to open up for the bishop to get involved. Knight to c3, bishop b7, bishop e3. I feel like white's just dominating the center of the board. So you always want to be careful, although you may look at it and say, oh yeah, I'm going to exchange material on the board. Things are even. Not always the case, especially when your opponent can recapture and have a better position. So don't just take right away. Bishop comes down here to c5 and then knight to c2. Now this is an interesting decision for Magnus Carlsen. I feel like this definitely gives Fabiano the advantage here because he's starting to control the center. The knight coming back here to c2 is not where Magnus Carlsen wants it. If he had another option, could have chose knight takes on c6. Pawn takes here, maybe the queens come off the board, bishop up here to f4. This feels much more aggressive from Magnus Carlsen. But he decides to go with knight to c2. Definitely seems to be part of his preparation for the rapid portion of this tournament. Knight to f6, attacking the pawn. Knight up here to c3, just development, but also defending that pawn here. Castle on the queen side, or king side. Bishop here to e3. Pawn to b6, just protecting this bishop here on c5. Yeah, Magnus Carlsen wants to exchange right here. There's going to be a nice central pawn for Fabiano controlling this dark square in the center of the board on d4. Bishop to e2, getting ready to castle on the king side. Bishop to b7, just trying to control this long light square diagonal, also attacking one of the center pawns for Magnus Carlsen. Castle on the king side, and then bishop here to e7. And kind of look at it as far as what black's going to do. He has one semi-open file here on the c file, so he could have brought his rook over here to c8, maybe pawn to h6 if he wants to block off this g5 square. Could also play d6 if he wants to, but instead decides to go ahead and bring his queen here to e7. Queen to d2 from Magnus Carlsen. Rook over here to d8. Rook to d1. So from Magnus's standpoint, there's one semi-open file open. It's the D file, so he's just putting everything he has on the D file. He has a pretty good setup here. but it really just comes down to, can he break through? There's a backwards pawn here on d7. Fabiano is going to have to defend that properly. Yes, he does have his own semi-open file here on the c file, so eventually he could navigate here, try to attack on the queen side of the board. Knight to e5, bishop takes an exchange here on c5, and then pawn up to f4. So while Magnus Carlsen did bring his knight back here to c2, and it seemed like it was somewhat passive, he has now started to push up, has the advantage in the center of the board. Knight comes back here to g6, queen to e3, pawn to d6, and then we see rook to d2. And Magnus Carlsen had a couple options. He could maneuver his knight over here to the king side, or even something like knight to e1, knight to d3 is an option, but instead decides to play rook to d2, so he can swing his other rook over here to d1 and have, you know, all of his material attacking on this d file. Also, may not want to right away. He could eventually bring his knight to f3 once it comes down here to e1. Does not want to block off all of the mobility of the queen here on e3. Pawn to a6 feels like a waiting move from Fabiano. Not really adding to anything he's trying to do right now. Does block off the knight coming to b5. Don't really think Magnus Carlsen is looking to do that. Plays rook to d1 as expected. Queen to c7, pawn to b3, just solidifying the pawn chain. Really like Magnus Carlsen's position so far. Pawn to h6, slowly building up a defense, while Magnus Carlsen slowly building up an offense. Pawn to g3, solidifying the pawn chain on the king side. Rook to d7. If the other rook wants to swing over here to d8, he could. Or if he wants to just spread his defense, could also come here to e8 as well. Bishop to f3. Rook to e8, queen back here to f2. Knight to e7, just maneuvering a little bit, but you can tell Fabiano, he has a cramped position over here. He's really just playing defense right now. Magnus starts the push. He plays pawn to h3, not as worried about protecting his king right here. He sees his opponent back here, not really being aggressive, so he says, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and start pushing. I need to try to get the victory here. Rook to d8. Feel like you could have done this a while ago. You can tell when you bring your rook over here to e8 and then move it to d8, you're really just buying time, seeing how Magnus Carlsen is going to attack and then try to defend correctly. Bishop to g2, knight to c6, trying to maneuver to a more active square. Pawn to g4, so pushing even further. Queen down here to a5, knight to a4, just stopping the threat of the queen coming down here to a2. Queen comes back to c7 and then pawn to e5. So both sides equal in material, but you could just tell that as way things are building up, Magnus Carlsen's going for a big exchange, and it starts with pawn to e5. Now, after the pawn takes, knight comes up here to c5, captures, rook takes, you see all this material start coming off the board, and then bishop comes back here to a8. And had different options. Could have taken the pawn here on f4 if he wanted to. Maybe then the knight takes on b7. We see some exchanging going on. I feel like this is going to be fine for both sides, but instead decides, let's go ahead and leave more material on the board. Bishop back here to a8. Pawn takes on e5, and then the queen comes down and takes on e5. Magnus gets his knight involved into the action up here, knight to d7, attacking the queen. Queen comes down to b2, attacking both the pawn and the knight here, and queen up to d6. Now, usually if you're playing Magnus Carlsen, you see him immediately abandon ship on this knight on c2. You know that you probably should not attack that knight right here, and that's exactly what he does. He plays knight taking up here on d7. You don't want to play queen takes on c2 because queen up here to f8, king moves, knight takes here, pawn's going to take. You can see starts to gobble up more material, putting a lot of pressure. Not something that Fabiano is looking to do. So instead, he takes with his knight. The queen takes. Now the knight falls. Queen up here to e8. After the king moves, then the bishop is going to fall. So Magnus Carlsen has the bishop versus the knight in the endgame. Queen down here to d1. King to h2. Queen d6. king down here to h1, and then knight to d4. So if we look at and say who has the advantage, because there's pawn chains on both sides of the board, the bishop is going to fare better. It can just control more of the board. If the pawns were all on one side of the board, then you would tend to favor the side with the knight. But right now, Magnus Carlsen definitely has the advantage. Queen coming back here to e4. You just want to centralize your powerful pieces like your queens, like your knights, even your bishops. They can just control more of the board. So that's exactly what this does. Pawn down to f5. So Fabiano trying to get aggressive on the king side with his pawns. After the pawn takes, pawn recaptures, queen down here to e3. Knight to e6, and then starts to push on the queen side. You can see that there's a huge threat that Magnus Carlsen has. If you look at the pawns, yes, it's 4v4, but it just seems more difficult for the pawns on the king side to push for Fabiano, where Magnus Carlsen, he's got 3v1 here, and both his queen and his bishop are both eyeing down, protecting the pawns as they push. So definitely feels like he has a strong advantage. Knight here to g5, pawn up to c5, attacking the queen. Queen comes over here to f6, and then pawn c6. What's the one thing you have to do with passed pawns? You push those passed pawns as fast as possible. And this is a tricky spot for Fabiano. How do you really defend against this? Knight to e6. It's an attempt, but it's just so tough to stop all the threats. Pawn to a4 says, yeah, I'm just going to start pushing up the board. If we can exchange here, I have two passed pawns. How does Fabiano ever block that? Knight to c7, trying to stop this one pawn from pushing forward. A queen here to f4. And this is a very important square for the queen for a couple reasons. One, it's attacking the knight, so that's rule number one. But two, it also is defending this dark square diagonal. And that's important because this king, if it ever gets attacked by the opponent's queen, needs to come here to h2 and have a safety area. If Fabiano could come down, check the king, and then just start coming back and forth between, e5 and a1, and Magnus Carlsen can't block that, we could just have a perpetual check and there would be a draw in this game. So having it on this dark square diagonal is extremely important for Magnus Carlsen. Knight to e6, attacking the queen. Queen comes up here to d6, an even better square. Now it's more centralized. This knight can't move, or the queen's going to come off the board, and it's going to be even more difficult to hold on to all this pressure Magnus Carlsen has. This also still defends the dark square diagonal. Queen comes down here, a1, and now you could see king up here to h2. Fabiano can't check the king anymore unless he wants to give up his queen, which he does not. So he comes down, knight to d4. Pawn up here to c7. You can see things are starting to crumble for Fabiano. Queen to c3, queen over here to c5, queen e3, and then the pawn promotes to the queen on c8. Now, if you thought Magnus Carlsen was deadly with one queen, he's even better with two. After pawn to f4, queen comes down here to g4, and Fabiano resigns. Now, this is game 3 from the rapid portion of the tournament, but just a heads up, Magnus Carlsen also won game 1 and 2, so he is the champion. Part of the reason I think that Fabiano went for something like the Sicilian defense, although he is very well versed in the Petrov defense, it tends to be more drawish. Knowing that he needed a win, he had to go for a very sharp defense. That's what the Sicilian does for you, but it also opens you up for a lot of attacking lines, and Magnus Carlsen came out of the opening with a better attack, but that's why he's the best fast chess player in the world, ranked number 1. And so that was part of his strategy, as many people are assuming, and he's kind of hinted at, is he was okay drawing in the classical style. He thought his opponent was a little more prepared than he was. There was a lot of games that you could tell he was spending a lot of time just trying to defend correctly. But at the end of the day, he knew that he had the advantage when it came to rapid or potentially blitz. And he won the first 3 games, didn't even have to play game number 4. So this was the final game in the 2018 World Chess Championship. Magnus Carlsen is again the champion. He will be the champion at least for 2 more years. 2020 is the next championship. So congratulations to him. Fabiano was cheering for him. Thought he would have been a great champion. especially to have an American win it since Bobby Fischer would have been huge. But Magnus Carlsen, the guy's just too good, does not lose at this stage. And this tournament's almost set up for his style to grind down opponents. So difficult to actually beat him. And then if you do get to the blitz portion, I mean, good luck. The guy is just so good. So congratulations to him. Thank you guys so much for following along with all of the tournament's coverage. 13 days that we've been going over this. Finally have a champion. Finally get to see a win. And not even huge mistakes, which is always nice. Sometimes there's a huge blunder. It's kind of even the entire time. Someone makes a blunder and then someone wins. But this was just Magnus Carlsen slowly and steady building up a better attack. And at the end of it, got the best of him. Fabiano made small, incremental, mistakes. Magnus Carlsen took advantage and got the victory. So congratulations again to him. And I will see you guys in a later video. Thanks again for watching. Bye.